Hey, Church United, this is Tom Hendricks. This week we're going to be talking about the topic of revival. And if you know anything about me, you know that this is a topic I've been drilling down on for the last couple of years. And I have come to the conclusion, just by studying it and just praying through it, guys, that more than anything else that we need, it is this. And when I say we, I don't just mean the people in the pews, the churches that we have the ability and really the privilege of shepherding. I mean we, I mean me, I mean you. What we need more than anything else is revival. I'm convinced that if revival is coming to this region, it's going to come first to us. So let's talk about it today, okay? And let's define the terms for starters. What is revival? Because I think that a lot of us bring out of our church experiences in the past a definition of revival that may or may not be accurate. And I'll give you myself as an example. So about 30 years ago, Beth and I were a part of another church. And every year on the church calendar, somewhere like in July, because it's the worst time to do things, this church had a revival, and we had like a big sign, and we put a sign out on the street, revival. The whole community knows we're having a revival. Like nobody in the community came, but the whole church, at least that was in town, did in fact come. And this precious, amazing couple who with their kids traveled all over the country doing revivals would come every year, and they would come and they would do a revival for us, all right? And the dad would preach, and the mom and the kids would sing, and it would start on a Wednesday night, and we'd go Wednesday night, and then we'd go Thursday night, and then we'd go Friday night. Wait, we're not done. We'd go Saturday. Still not done. We'd go Saturday night. Hey, Sunday morning, you know what? How about Sunday night? And then it would wrap up with a really generous love offering that these amazing, precious people totally deserved and earned. And here's what it was. It was a wonderful time for the church. We ate all kinds of high cholesterol food. I mean, it was great. We sat around tables. We had a lot of extra time with people. We built relationships. We worshiped together. We studied God's words. We did all of that stuff. It was absolutely, however, not a revival. When you look at revival biblically, when you look at it historically, here's what it is. A revival is a special season of divine visitation in which God the Holy Spirit awakens His slumbering church. And just to encourage you, when you study revival throughout the centuries, from the first century until now, God has moved in that kind of a way. He has awakened at least some part of His church somewhere in the world in every single century since the first century, which brings me to my next question, which is why study revival? And why should we do that? And the answer is to awaken within us a hunger for it, to inspire within us an appetite for it, and to give us faith for it. Listen to what Charles Spurgeon says. I love this. He said, when people hear about what God used to do, one of the things they say is, that was a long time ago. And I just want to stop there in the quote for a second and go, all right, let's be honest. That's how a lot of us are thinking. Our revival, that's something you read about in a history book, right? That's something that happened a long, long, long time. Culture has changed. Everything's changed. Couldn't possibly happen now. Let me start the Spurgeon quote again because he addresses that directly. He says, when people hear about what God used to do, one of the things they say is, oh, that was a long time ago. Now here's his response. He says, I thought it was God that did it. Has God changed? Is He not the immutable God? Does that not furnish an argument to prove that what God has done at one time, He can do at another? Nay, Spurgeon says, I think I may push it a little further and say that what God has done once is a prophecy of what He intends to do again, to which he adds, let us take the blame of it, meaning let us take the blame for the absence of revival in our own day upon ourselves, and with earnestness seek that God would restore to us the what? The faith of the men of old, so that we may richly enjoy His grace, as in the days of old. And by the way, he said that on July 17 of 1859, the very year that revival came to his home city of London. We need faith for it. We've got to believe for it. All right, so the third question is, what is the goal of revival? Because I think this is a little bit like the definition. You think you know the answer, and then you study it, and you go, wait a minute, maybe it's different. And what I want to do is use the Welsh revival of 1904 to illustrate the point that I'm trying to make here, which is it's different than what you might think it is. So, for example, the Welsh revival was marked by evangelism. Guys, in the first 2 months, in the little country of 1904 Wales, which was smaller than Broward County, Florida at that time, over 70,000 people came to faith in Jesus. 2 months. Like if 70,000 people came to faith in Broward County right now, we'd be freaking out. 2 months? That's remarkable. It's amazing. And I want to see people come to faith in Jesus. And you want to see people come to faith in Jesus. That's a lot of what drives us together as brothers in mission together for the sake of our city. We want to see people come to faith in Jesus. That is absolutely not the goal of revival. It's not. Let me give you another for instance. The Welsh revival was marked by passionate worship. Oh man, listen to what G. Campbell Morgan says. G. Campbell Morgan was the pastor of Westminster Chapel at the time of the Welsh revival. He went to Wales. I mean, it's not that far away from him. He was in London. He said, I got to see this for myself. He went and he saw it for himself. This is what he wrote about their worship. He was stunned by the energy. He said, no books, but oh my. I nearly wept tonight over the singing of our last hymn. When these Welshmen sing, they sing the words like men who believe them. They abandon themselves to their singing. We, he says, sing as though we thought it would not be respectable to be heard by the man next to us. No choir, did I say? It was all choir. And hymns, I stood and listened in wonder and amazement as that congregation on that night sang hymn after hymn, long hymns sung through without hymn books. Man, I don't know about you, but I want that. That's the kind of worship service I want to go to. Like if you're having that, call me. I'm going to come to your church and worship with you. I get glimpses of that where I'm at. I get glimpses of that sometimes when we're together. Village hymns give me glimpses of that. One city in particular gives me glimpses of that. And it's beautiful and it's amazing. And it's not the goal of revival either. What about sweeping cultural and societal change? Because I mean, to use that as an example, that was absolutely true of the Welsh revival, and it's been true of all these other revivals as well. As you read through it, like culture changes. And guys, I want culture to change. Like I am looking around right now, and it's just madness. It's insanity. We are taking mental instability and celebrating it. In fact, we're trying to legislate it into normality. We've lost our minds in so very many ways that's distressing and disturbing to me. I long for it. And when revival comes, it happens. I mean, in the Welsh revival, for example, the police were left with basically nothing to do. The courts, they tell us, were empty. Public drunkenness, which I guess was a big deal, disappeared. The bars and saloons closed down for lack of customers. Traveling theatrical companies canceled all their dates in Wales because everyone was in church every night. Cursing, which I guess was also a big deal, also basically disappeared from culture. And I think this is pretty funny. It was said that horses everywhere were like in this state of confusion because they were used to responding to the cursing commands of their owners who were no longer cursing. So like the horses didn't know what to do. Debts that were long forgotten were repaid. Relationships were refounded. Marriages were saved. Remarkable and amazing things happened. None of that is the goal of revival. So what is the goal of revival? The goal of revival is God himself. It is the presence of God, yes, revealed to the world, but through his people. It is God visiting his people. It is him answering the prayer of Isaiah in Isaiah 62, where Isaiah cries out. He says, oh, that you would rend the heavens and come down. That's revival. God is the goal. His presence is the prize. And the Welsh people experienced that as well. There are accounts of that. One pastor said this. He says, if one were asked to describe in a word the outstanding feature of those days, one would unhesitatingly reply that it was a universal, inescapable sense of the presence of God. The Lord had come down. A sense of the Lord's presence was everywhere. It pervaded, he says, nay, it created the spiritual atmosphere. Another pastor said eternal issues were discussed freely and unashamedly, and above all, a sense of the presence and holiness of God pervaded every area of human experience, at home, at work, in shops and public houses. Eternity, he says, seemed inescapably near and real. Yet another pastor said, I have no more doubt of its being a work of God than I have of my own existence. As to describing the revival and estimating its results, can you put into words those deep and hallowed experiences of life, realized when God meets you almost palpably and sways your whole being crossward, heavenward, and the atmosphere trembles with light, life, love, joy, praise, reverence, and awe. Guys, the goal of revival is God amongst his people, starting with me, starting with you. So then the next question is, all right, well then what brings revival? Or really, I think a better stated question is what always precedes revival, because only God can bring revival. It's not like you can go into the Bible and into history and figure out all of these elements, and then if you like an ATM code, and if you can just put them all into the little keypad in just the right order and hit enter, now God is obligated somehow to then bring revival. Come on, we did it just the way you... But as you study it, you realize that there are aspects that always precede it. There are things that call it into being. And the first of those things is prayer. And I mean persistent prayer. I mean like big time prayer. Dr. A.T. Pearson said this. He studied revival, and he said, there has never been a spiritual awakening in any country or locality that did not begin in united prayer, the kind of prayer that like Jacob when he wrestles with the angel of the Lord, like even in his injured state, maybe because of his injured state, he grabs hold of the Lord and he says, I will not let you go until you give me your blessing. That kind of prayer. Think about the Great Awakenings. There were 3. When did the first Great Awakening begin? It began on a Monday, January 1, 1739, when John and Charles Wesley and George Whitefield and 64 other people gathered together on that New Year's Day for prayer and for praise. And listen to what John Wesley writes in his diary. He says that at about 3 a.m., and I just want to pause there for a second and ask you, when was the last time you were up praying at 3 a.m.? Not like, because you're awake in the middle of the night and you got a million things going on and you're stressed about this and you're like, oh, dear God, let me go back to sleep. But for a move of God, for the presence of God, for the power of God to fill you, to fill your family, to fill your church, to fill the church, to fill this region. Anyway, Wesley says that about 3 a.m., the power of God came mightily upon us, insomuch that many fell to the ground. As soon as we recovered a little from the awe and amazement at the presence of his majesty, we broke out with one voice. We praise thee, O God. We acknowledge thee to be the Lord. Listen, on Friday of that same week, they got together again, this group, for a day of prayer and fasting. And George Whitefield, at about 3 p.m., he says they broke at about 3 p.m. And then here's what he writes in his diary. He says, we parted with the full conviction that God was going to do great things among us. And boy, did he. Guys, he turned the world upside down through these men. Or really, through himself at work in these men. What about the Second Great Awakening? I kind of like this one a lot. And the reason for that is because of the spiritual state of our country. So the Second Great Awakening came on the heels of the American Revolution, and it came at a time, and this might be new information for you, in which Christianity was all but dead. Like we look around today and we're like, Christianity, it's on the ropes. But dead? John Marshall, who was the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, wrote to the Bishop of Virginia in that day, and he said that in his opinion, the church was too far gone ever to be redeemed. Thomas Paine said Christianity will be forgotten in 30 years. Like in 30 years from now, he's saying, in his day, nobody's going to know who Jesus is. Christianity, what are you talking about? That's the state of our nation. Until the Second Great Awakening came, and it came to us from Great Britain, and it began in Great Britain in what was called the Union of Prayer. What about the Third Great Awakening? That began here. It's the only one to start and originate in the United States, and it started in New York City with a man named Jeremy Lanphier, who was a Christian businessman there, and he was concerned for the spiritual state of his city and of his nation. And he figured, I can't be alone. So he rented a hall, big enough for a crowd is the idea, on Fulton Street in New York City. And he started putting advertisements for a businessman's 12 o'clock, lunchtime prayer meeting for the state of the country, for the state of the city, and so forth. He put posters all over town. No doubt he got there that day early and he set up all the chairs. He's ready for the crowd. 6 people show up. 6, which is better than 5. But it's not 600. And then he remembered the words of Jesus, where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name. There I am in the midst of them. And he thought, would I rather have Jesus or 600? He went with Jesus, and those 6 people prayed. And then the next week they got together, and this time there was 14 of them. And they prayed. And then the next week they got together. This time there was 23 of them. And they said, we should do this every day. And so then they started doing it every day. And within a few months, New York City was filled with halls and churches full of tens of thousands of people who were praying for revival. They were praying that God would rend the heavens and come down, that God would visit his people. And that spread throughout our country. That spread over to Europe. It spread all throughout Europe and other countries as well, Korea, Australia, like in lots of different places. And then it died down in America, and then it came back. They like regifted it to us. And it spread again throughout our country. Guys, prayer, persistent prayer, is an absolutely indispensable prerequisite to revival. Jesus gives us that great story about the unjust judge and the widow who just, she just keeps coming back until she gets what she wants. And he says, God's not unjust. God wants to give you these things. But look at how it ends. It ends with this statement where he says, but when the Son of Man returns, will he find that kind of faith in the earth? And I guess what I'm asking is, will he find that kind of faith in me? Is he going to find that kind of faith in you and us? So prayer is an indispensable prerequisite to revival, but so also is repentance, just a passion for holy living, a dealing with our sin and dealing with it quickly. Listen to what Colin Urquhart says. This man, too, is a man who is a student of revival. He's written a great book, by the way, called Great Revivals. I encourage you to read it. But he says this, he says, if we were to ask why the church is not in a permanent state of revival, we would have to confess that the principal reason is that such times are costly. And the cost is not only in prayer, it is, he says, the fervent prayer of the righteous that availeth much before God. During revival, there is a real concern among Christians for righteousness and holiness, to be more Christ-like. He continues, only if Christians are living in righteousness will they have an effective witness into a nation where there is much unrighteousness. Only if they are living in love, joy, and peace themselves can they bring hope into what is largely a hopeless society. It is only when they put the claims of the gospel above all other considerations, seeking first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, that they find God doing what? Because this is revival. They find God meeting with them in their needs and ready to bless others through them. This is not to say that men can contrive revivals, nor can they ever deserve them. Notice this, he says they can only seek God for such times of blessing while being prepared to do what? To let the work begin in their own hearts and in their own lives, which brings me to my final question, which is how is your own personal state of revival? Because as I said at the beginning, man, I think if it's coming, then, guys, it's going to start with us. I've been reading the books of a guy named Pete Greig. I highly commend them to you. He's the founder of the 24/7 prayer movement. He's the pastor of a church called Emmaus Road in Guilford, England. And this guy, through his writings and a couple of podcasts that I've listened to as I'm driving around town, has become my friend. I've never met him. I'm trying to get a meeting with him in October, actually, in Guilford, but I've never met him, and I love this guy. And he was preaching in this church up in New York City. And they brought him in because he just did his 8th book on prayer, How to Hear God. And so he comes in to do the talk on how to hear God. Everybody knows he's the prayer guru, right? So he gets up to give his talk. He's introducing himself. He's talking to the crowd, blah, blah, blah. And then all of a sudden he just says to everybody, hey, I'll be honest. We're going to talk about prayer today, but I'm not into prayer at all. And everybody sort of laughs, and then it kind of gets a little weird. Like the laughter sort of dies down. You can hear it. Because I guess he's deadpanning. He's like, no, really, I'm not into prayer at all. But I'm really into Jesus. And so I talk with Jesus, and then he talks with me. That's prayer. Just to continue it, he's like, I'm not into evangelism either. Who wants to do that? I'd rather just put my AirPods in and sit in the coffee shop and hopefully be by myself in the midst of the crowd. He's like, I just love Christ. I'm in love with Jesus. And here's what happens. I talk about the things I love and the people that I love. And so I end up talking to people about Jesus. And some of these people come to faith in Jesus. He's like, I'm not into justice. I'm massively selfish. I don't want to spend my money and give it away on things like that. I don't want to get involved with these people. They're super messy. It's going to eat up my schedule. It's going to mess with my emotions. It's going to make me do all kinds of uncomfortable things, but I love Jesus. And because I love Jesus, here's what I do. I go out and pick fights with his enemies. What is he saying because it is biblical? He's saying the stuff you do out here, your doings, dare I say it, your duties. They come organically. They flow organically. They're empowered by a heart that is aflame with a passion for, with a love for Jesus. It's what Jesus says. I mean, we all know the verse. I am the vine, you are the branches, right? If a man remains in me and I in him, what happens? Organically, he bears much fruit. Like he prays because he loves me and therefore we talk. He tells other people about me because he loves me, and that's just what you do with people that you love. He gets involved and picks fights with my enemies because they're my enemies and he loves me. But then don't forget the next line. You know what it is before I say it, but let me say it. We need to hear it. Apart from me, you can do nothing. Look, I'm not trying to build IBM. I'm not even trying to build like a really thriving 7-Eleven. I'm trying to build a small piece of the Church of Jesus Christ, and so are you. Look, apart from me, you can do nothing, but you can wear yourself out for darn sure with all the doings, with all the duties, if there's no fire in the heart. So in closing, I want to challenge you to do two things. And the first thing, I want to challenge you to dare to believe for revival. You know what's happened in every century? Dare to believe for it. I think that's what holds us back. We look at it and we go, come on, that's something you read about in a history book. I want to be in a history book. I mean, I don't care if my name's in the history book. I just want something to happen in the church that makes a history book that I'm alive for, that I'm around for, that I can be a part of. And I want to call you to believe, listen, I thought it was God who did it. Has he changed? Is he not the immutable God? Is not what he's done in the past, in fact, in every century until now, a predictive statement in terms of what he would like to do, even in our day? So the first thing is to dare to believe for revival, but the second thing is to own your own fire. And that's a statement I've been using with our staff, so forgive me. I'm going to use it with you guys too. You're not on my staff. I totally get that. But you got to own your own fire. Here's the deal. You can't bring the fire, but here's what you can do with the fireplace of your heart. You can gather the wood and put it in there. You can get the kindling and stick it all up under the wood. You can get, you can't get newspaper because, what is that even now? But you can get some of your notepads. Surely you have some of that. Tear a bunch of pages and stuff it underneath the kindling, which is underneath the wood. You can get out the lighter fluid and just douse the heck out of it. And then like Elijah, you can cry out to the God who wants to bring fire from heaven and ask him to do it in you. I'm asking him to do it in me. And then through us, in our churches. It's this beautiful story of Samson. He goes out and he gathers 300 foxes. He takes their foxes and he ties their tails together and he lights a torch and he ties it to the tails of these foxes that he's paired up, and then he sets them loose in the fields of the Philistines, who did not think this was a beautiful story at all. But it's beautiful because what it says to me is that I think what God's trying to do here in South Florida is gather up some foxes and tie us together and light us on fire and then set us free in the fields. What? In our community? No. In our own churches. And then through our churches, evangelism happens. Justice happens. Societal change happens. All of these things happen. Guys, own your fire. I close with this. G. Campbell Morgan, again, pastor of Westminster Chapel in London during the Welsh revival, who went to see it, came back, and on Christmas Day, he said this in his Christmas Day sermon to his church, and I think he says this to us today. Take it to heart. He says, if you and I could stand above Wales looking at it, you would see fire breaking out here and there and yonder and somewhere else without any collusion or prearrangement. It is a divine visitation in which God, and then he says, and let me say this reverently, in which God is saying to us, see what I can do without the things you are depending on. See what I can do in answer to a praying people. See what I can do through the simplest who are ready to fall in line and depend wholly and absolutely upon me. Here's what we've seen to date. We have seen what God can do with the things we are depending on. I want to see what he can do without them. I want to see what he can do just by lighting a fire in me and in you, and then through us in all of our churches. I long for the day when, if you could stand above South Florida, you would see fires breaking out here, there, there, and there, for the glory of Christ. So, believe for revival. Own your fire. I'll see you soon. God bless you guys. Love each of you.